Throughout history, many an idea seemed brilliant when first introduced, but turned out to be not so bright in hindsight. For example, there was a decades-long stretch in the 20th century when millions of shoe shoppers were exposed to dangerous levels of radiation from shoe store X-ray machines, or the time when an earlier iteration of Exxon bragged about its ability to melt millions of tons of glaciers per day. Following are 20 fascinating things about seemingly great ideas that aged like garbage. The idea to use X-ray machines in shoe stores. Finding out if a shoe fits one's foot is pretty straightforward. The idea and execution are pretty basic. Put the shoes on your feet, then walk up and down the store aisle for a bit to see how they feel. However, back in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and into the 70s, things were different in many shoe stores across America and Europe. For about 5 decades in the 20th century, many shoe stores overthought the simple concept of trying on shoes, and decided to get overly fancy and science-y with it. Instead of sticking to the tried-and-true practice of just letting people try on shoes, shoe stores decided to use radiation machines to blast their customers' feet with unshielded X-rays. The idea behind X-ray shoe fitters. In the early 1920s, a Dr. Jacob Lowe demonstrated a modified medical device at shoe retailer conventions in Boston and Milwaukee that X-rayed people's feet. Other inventors in the same period had the same idea and came up with similar devices, known as shoe-fitting fluoroscopes, and also sold under the names X-ray shoe fitters, pedoscopes, and photoscopes. The devices were metal constructions covered in wood, about 4 feet high. Installed in shoe stores, child or adult customers would don a pair of shoes in which they were interested, stick their feet into the device while standing, then look down through a porthole at an X-ray view of their feet in the shoes. The bones and the shoe outline were clearly visible. A pair of other viewing portholes on the machine sides allowed the shoe salesman and anybody else accompanying the customer to look at the toes wiggling to get an idea of how much space there was in the shoes. A bad idea. On its face, the basic idea behind X-ray shoe fitters was brilliant. The drawback was that nobody paid attention to the dangers inherent in using unshielded X-rays around people, especially when done frequently. Even more especially when blasted directly up at the customer's genitals, which were located directly above the device as they stood over it, while the machine X-rayed their feet. Back then, people were either ignorant of the risks of radiation exposure, or did not take them seriously. The X-ray shoe fitter devices were supposed to be shielded, but the shield was usually removed to improve the image quality, or to make the device lighter. As a result, a significant amount of radiation was scattered in all directions, bathing the bodies of the customers and shoe salespeople in harmful X-rays. Unsurprisingly, there were severe downsides and side effects. X-ray shoe fitters bathed everybody in the vicinity with dangerous radiation. A typical X-ray shoe fitter viewing lasted about 20 seconds, during which the machine delivered about half the radiation of a chest CT scan. Many customers tried on more than one pair of shoes, and thus ended up getting exposed to additional X-ray doses with each pair. Even people sitting in the waiting room got exposed to radiation. Many shoe stores did not think that saving money by skimping on machine maintenance was a bad idea. As a result, many X-ray shoe fitters emitted significantly more radiation. Some devices blasted out as much as 300 times more radiation than the maximum safe limit. Most exposed were the shoe salespeople. They got hit with stray radiation dozens of times a day, each and every day they went to work. A seemingly brilliant idea that inflicted serious damage. Many of those exposed to radiation from X-ray shoe fitters suffered adverse health consequences, some quite serious, unfortunately. Medical monitoring and product safety investigating back then was not what it is today. As a result, accurate figures for just how severe and widespread was the damage are lacking. However, while we do not have an idea about the actual extent of the damage there undoubtedly was. The first serious alarms were raised in 1957, when the British Medical Journal ran an article about a middle-aged woman with skin damage and pain consistent with radiation burns. She had worked in a shoe store for 10 years, where she operated an X-ray shoe fitter 15 to 20 times a day, often demonstrating how it worked by inserting her own foot in the device. Worse still was the fate of an unfortunate shoe model, who received so much radiation her leg had to be amputated. regulating and getting rid of X-ray shoe fitters. There were no safety or health regulations in place when X-ray shoe fitters were first invented, and for decades, few paid attention to their dangers. For example, an estimated 10,000 devices were sold in America, about 3,000 in Britain, 1,500 in Switzerland, and 1,000 in Canada before the authorities stepped in and began discouraging their use. As awareness grew of the long-term adverse health effects of radiation, the notion that the widespread use of X-ray machines in shoe stores might be a bad idea gained in popularity. Accordingly, voices were raised to regulate the devices, and eventually, to prohibit their use. In 1958, Britain mandated warning signs on the devices, and the following year, Switzerland prohibited their use. By 1970, the devices had been banned in 33 American states, and by the end of the decade, the last recorded sighting of an X-ray shoe fitter occurred in Boston. Exxon's predecessor bragged about how much glacier cap it could melt. When pouring through advertisements from decades and generations past, we frequently come across ads that were totally innocuous and non-controversial for their era, but that have aged like garbage, due to social, political, or technological advances and changes. Things that seemed like a good idea, and that were perfectly acceptable in one era, can be seen today as silly, ridiculous, or outright offensive. An example of that dynamic can be seen in an advertisement run in 1962 by Humble Oil and Refining Company, which eventually rebranded as Exxon for its Esso brand gasoline. The company, contra its name, bragged about its size and technical efficiency by boasting that it could melt millions of tons of glaciers every single day of the year. When bragging about destroying the environment sounded like a good idea. As the text of Humble Oil's ad put it, each day Humble supplies enough energy to melt 7 million tons of glacier. This giant glacier has remained unmelted for centuries, yet the petroleum energy Humble supplies, if converted into heat, could melt it at a rate of 80 tons each second. To meet the nation's growing needs for energy, Humble has supplied science to nature's resources to become America's leading energy company. Working wonders with oil through research, Humble provides energy in many forms, to help heat our homes, power our transportation, and to furnish industry with a great variety of versatile chemicals. Stop at a Humble station for new Esso Extra gasoline, and see why the happy motoring sign is the world's first choice. An idea that aged like garbage. Needless to say, Humble Oil's non-humble boast that it produced enough energy to melt 7 million tons of glaciers every day did not age well. A few decades later on down the road, scientists began sounding the alarm about the dangers of global warming, a growing menace caused in large part by fossil fuels, such as those produced by Humble Oil. Back in 1962, the ad's copywriters thought they had come up with a clever idea, and were blissfully unaware of what the future would bring. They certainly had not anticipated that melting glaciers would become a major symbol of the risks of global warming. Setting out to actually melt the Arctic. Humble Oil only boasted about its ability to melt the polar ice caps, but did not actually propose an idea to deliberately melt them. Not so the Soviet Union, which actively sought to get rid of the Arctic in the name of progress. Today, melting polar ice caps are a major concern, seeing as how the resultant rise in sea levels threatens low-lying coastal plains around the world where billions live. However, in the 1950s, when most people had never even heard of global warming, let alone understood its ramifications, things were pretty different. Back then, polar ice was seen by many not as something positive worth preserving, but as a negative that should be gotten rid of. The sooner, the better. The idea of getting rid of the polar ice cap was especially popular in the USSR, a huge chunk of which lay under permafrost. The frozen conditions held up many economic development projects, so authorities explored plans to warm up the country. The idea that got the most traction was to melt the entire Arctic ice cap. A dam across the Bering Strait. Soviet scientist Petr Mikhailovich Borisov came up with the idea of building a 55-mile dam across the entire Bering Strait between the USSR and Alaska. Doing so would block cold Pacific Ocean currents from reaching the Arctic, while allowing the Atlantic Ocean's warm Gulf Stream currents to circulate more freely. That would gradually melt the Arctic ice cap, until the North Pole was completely ice-free. The Soviet government found Borisov's concept intriguing, and his idea even made waves in the West, where JFK called it certainly worth exploring. However, the plan fizzled out not due to environmental concerns but cost concerns. and the difficulty of securing the US-Soviet cooperation necessary to carry out such an ambitious geoengineering project. A giant customs barrier. Northern India has relatively few sources of salt, and throughout most of history, the region had to import it from elsewhere in the subcontinent. When the British conquered India, they hit upon the idea of cashing in on that by monopolizing salt production, then gouging the natives for all they could get out of them via stringent salt taxes. The salt tax proved hugely unpopular with the Indian public. Protests over its collection helped fuel the rise of Indian nationalism and sow the seeds of India's independence movement. More immediately, however, the British had to contend with rampant salt smuggling from southern India, where salt was abundant and salt taxes were low, to northern India, where the opposite was true. So came up with the idea of growing a giant hedge of thorn bushes, stretching across India for thousands of miles. The Great Hedge of India. Known as the Great Hedge of India, the customs barrier was supposed to stretch for 2,500 miles, 14 feet wide, 12 feet high, and bristling with thorns. By 1878 the Great Hedge stretched for 1,100 miles, but the idea hit a snag when the thorn bushes refused to grow properly. Most of the hedge ended up consisting dead branches. Still the British persisted with their idea, and eventually grew 500 miles of proper hedge, that was patrolled by 12,000 customs officers. That army of officials had to contend with brush fires, storms, parasitic vines and pests. The barrier did little to stop smugglers, who easily circumvented the hedge by hacking a way through it or by simply tossing bags of salt over the barrier to accomplices on the other side. The Great Hedge was abandoned in 1879, when the authorities decided to simply impose and collect the salt tax at the point of manufacture, then have the manufacturers pass it on to buyers. Investing in a crazy Nazi scientist's plans. In the spring of 1951, newspapers around the globe carried sensational news of the discovery of practical fusion power in Argentina. On March 24 of that year, Argentina's President Juan Perón announced that his country had mastered the controlled liberation of atomic energy, not from uranium but from hydrogen. He added that the discovery would prove transcendental for the future life of Argentina, and would bring it a greatness which today we cannot imagine. Juan Perón went on to promise a future in which energy would be sold in half-liter bottles like milk. However, thermonuclear fusion was advanced technology that neither the US nor USSR had mastered at the time. So the idea that Argentina, then a rural country of fewer than 16 million people, had achieved what neither global superpower could was baffling. How had Argentina pulled off such a feat? The answer was, it had not. The Wacky Nazi. As things turned out, Juan Perón had been conned by a German World War II aircraft designer named Ronald Richter, who had wildly misrepresented his credentials in a successful bid to get funding for a fusion reactor. Argentine scientists knew Richter's claims were BS, but Perón wanted to believe in the Nazi scientist's idea, so he did. The end result was that a significant chunk of Argentina's budget was diverted into building a massive compound for Richter on Hummel Island, in an Andean lake. In a humiliation for all involved, Richter's claims were debunked almost immediately. After they were announced by Perón, Richter was eventually jailed for having misled the Argentine president, and his embarrassed government razed most of the lab to the ground, and tried to pretend the whole thing had never happened. After Richter was released from prison, he settled down to become a chicken farmer, but continued to insist to his dying days that his idea had been practical, and that he had mastered nuclear fusion. Stealing a river. Egypt was a British client state and protectorate from 1882 to 1952, and Britain had the right to base troops in Egypt to protect her interests. Most important of those interests was safeguarding the Suez Canal, of which the British government was a majority shareholder. Then in 1952 a military coup by nationalist Egyptian officers, led by Gamal Abdel Nasser, overthrew Egypt's pro-British king. The new government demanded that British troops leave Egypt, and in 1956, nationalize the Suez Canal. Nasser and his nationalist government infuriated British Prime Minister Anthony Eden, who was determined to cut the Egyptian upstart down to size and put him in his place. So his government came up with the idea of blocking the Nile, to prevent its water from reaching Egypt. Blocking the Nile. To coerce the Egyptian regime of Gamal Abdel Nasser, the British government drew up secret plans to cut off the flow of the water, in an attempt to force their opponent to toe the line. In 1956 Britain still controlled Uganda, where the Owen Falls Dam lay astride the White Nile, a main source of the river flowing into Egypt. The idea was cut off the flow in Uganda, thus reducing the Nile by 7/8 by the time it reached Egypt. The plan was ultimately rejected because it would deprive other countries between Uganda and Egypt of water, would take too long, and would produce a PR nightmare. Instead, Eden opted for a direct military intervention. It turned out to be another bad idea. The result was the 1956 Suez Crisis, which ended with Britain forced into a humiliating climb down, and the demise of Anthony Eden's political career. Bombing the sky to make it rain. In 1871, former Civil War General Edward Powers wrote War and the Weather, in which he documented several battles throughout history that were followed by rain. He theorized that the loud din of battle agitated the clouds and caused them to release the rain stored within. Powers' idea gave birth to what came to be known as concussion theory, which held that clouds could be forced to yield rain via loud noises. As Powers put it, if lightning and thunder and rain have been brought on by the agency of man, when bloodshed and slaughter were only intended, this surely can be done without these latter concomitants. Credible scientists and scholars scoffed at the idea, but 2 decades later Senator Charles B. Farwell of Illinois read Powers' book and decided to test concussion theory. So he got Congress to appropriate $10,000 to make the tests. When facts fail, fabrication must suffice. No serious scholars or scientists were willing to risk their reputations by having anything to do with something as wacky as the idea of concussion theory, so a patent lawyer named Robert G. Deerenforth was assigned the task of carrying out the experiment. In August of 1891, Deerenforth set up shop in a section of Texas prairie and put on what must have been an impressive pyrotechnic display. His men blasted clouds with mortars and with dynamite carried aloft by kites, while trailing behind them were balloons filled with flammable hydrogen. To add to the noise, Deerenforth's men increased the decibel levels by packing prairie dog holes full of dynamite and setting them off as well. Unsurprisingly, the plan did not work, but Deerenforth claimed it did. Deerenforth's fabrication was foiled, however, by a meteorologist who observed the experiment and published a scathing report about it in Nature. Dissuading protesters with rain. American ideas about forcing the skies to give up their water survived into the 20th century and the Vietnam War. By 1963, South Vietnamese president and U.S. puppet ruler Ngo Dinh Diem was on the ropes. His regime, marked by extreme nepotism, extraordinary graft and astonishing levels of corruption, was hugely unpopular. Between the steadily intensifying Viet Cong insurgency and economic hardships, South Vietnam was seething. Protests were erupting up and down the country, only to be brutally put down by Diem's security forces, that only added more fuel to the fire and gave the South Vietnamese more cause for protest. However bad as Diem might have been, he was still America's man in Saigon. So the U.S. government tried to do what it could to prop him up, before finally abandoning Diem and backing a coup that overthrew him. Before washing its hands of Diem, however, the U.S. thought up some batty ideas of supporting him. One such was the idea to literally dampen protesters' enthusiasm with man-made rain.